Chapter 2. The unpromising Peter takes over. The man who denied Christ 3 times becomes his fearless witness before officialdom and the people. On a quiet, stone-paved alley just outside the Zion Gate in Jerusalem's Old City stands an unadorned 2-story stone building, dwarfed by the tower and dome of the adjacent Dormition Abbey. From the doorway on the alley, a set of steps leads to the 2nd floor of the building. Passing a guard reading his Hebrew newspaper, the visitor proceeds into a renovated room, 25 by 25 feet, whose Gothic arches and stained glass windows testify to its origins as a 12th century Crusader church. Arabic inscriptions on the walls evidence its subsequent history as a mosque. Visitors shuffle through, some stopping to pray aloud or sing with others in their tour groups. Almost no archaeologist would unreservedly agree with 12th century pilgrims and 21st century visitors, however, that the building stands on the site of the upper room, scene of the Last Supper, the place where 50 days later the Holy Spirit descended and empowered the Christian Church to spread the message of Jesus Christ to the world. Still, whether at this very place or at another not far from it, something powerful and strange certainly occurred on that Jewish feast called Pentecost, on or about the year A.D. 31. Those who were present told a gripping story. First, they heard a terrific rushing sound, like a mighty wind filling the whole house. As they looked around in astonishment, each could see what they would later describe to the best of their abilities as something that was essentially indescribable. It was as though tiny tongues of fire rested over the head of each man, they said, and when they tried to speak, words from languages none of them knew fell from their lips. Some people later scoffed, saying the whole bunch must be drunk, but others who heard them, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and Asians and visitors from many other nations who were present for the feast, recognized the languages as their own, and were astonished to hear and understand, in the fluent outbursts from these ordinary Galileans, praises of the works of God. As for the speakers, they found the experience eerie and wonderful, the most exciting thing that had happened to them ever. Whatever it was that took place in that room that day, it completely transformed the tiny circle of very frightened men and women who had cowered there after the crucifixion of their leader, the Nazarene Jesus, who they now said was not only the Messiah, but a Messiah risen from death, alive. Intellectually, scholastically, socially, and above all, ecclesiastically, they were a collection of nobodies, and not even Jerusalem nobodies. Most of them came from Galilee, a rustic backwater. Now, out of their hideout on that future quiet alley they poured, advancing upon the temple, fearless, fervid, and imbued with a message that most of the temple's officialdom definitely did not anticipate and would not want to hear. Even the temple itself failed to intimidate them, though the mere bulk and soaring stone of its walls The grandeur of its decor was obviously calculated to intimidate everybody. Chief among its integrities was its sheer permanence. It had stood for 545 years. No one could conceive that, in another 39, at the hands of the overwhelming forces of Rome, it would be utterly destroyed. The temple site, holiest area in the holy city of Jerusalem, had been chosen by King Solomon himself when, in about 960 BC, he built the first temple there, as a home for the cherished Ark of the Covenant and a center for Jewish worship. Solomon's temple was demolished around 586 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar, who razed the entire city of Jerusalem as well, and carried the Jews off to his own land, Babylon. When the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem in 538, they began building the second temple on the desolate site of the first, and though the new temple was declared complete in 515 BC, it endured the successive waves of non-Jewish domination that followed the surrender of Jerusalem to the great Macedonian general Alexander. Jewish rebels seized Jerusalem again in 167 BC and once more dedicated the temple for worship. Then came Herod the Great, appointed king of Judea in 37 BC, 25 years after Rome conquered the Holy Land and declared it a client state. Herod, a half-Jew, won his position by serving as advisor, mentor, and confidant to Julius Caesar and his imperial successor Octavius Augustus, founders of what had by now become the greatest empire the world had ever known. On their behalf, Herod ordered unflinchingly whatever slaughter or carnage the preservation of peace and good order seemed to require. The massacre of the infants at Bethlehem, marked and mourned as villainy by Christians for the next 2,000 years, was an undistinguished incident in his sanguinary record. Not for nothing, however, is he known to history as Herod the Great. Once he was installed by the Romans as puppet king of the Jews, his spectacular redevelopment program changed the face of the Holy Land. But his mightiest achievement was his magnificent expansion and adornment of the temple at Jerusalem, an architectural triumph that would astonish the world. With huge cut stones weighing as much as 50 tons, he bent the rule that the temple area could not be broadened, creating a massive stone platform that buried the form of the mountain upon which it sat. A section of Herod's platform would survive into the 21st century. All of this history was known, of course, to Peter and the others as they approached the temple, still deeply stirred within by what had happened to them in the upper room, their conviction strengthened by Peter's strong confidence and impulsive resolve. Recognized by the group as their senior spokesman and by the Catholic Christians as the Church's first pope, Peter was certainly one of the two central figures in the tumultuous events that were about to unfold. To future generations, especially those with 21st century sensibilities, he would seem an unlikely leader. He was a fisherman when he joined Jesus, and the gospel accounts make clear that he was impetuous and hot-tempered, quick to assert his opinions and just as quick to recant them when rebuked. Worst of all, shortly after Jesus' arrest, a badly frightened Peter had flatly and repeatedly denied any connection with him, pretending to know nothing whatever about him. Even after the resurrection, Jesus' last words on earth to Peter were an admonition. Despite these flaws, Peter also had his strengths. He had spent his life as a commercial fisherman, and no one who has seen a commercial fisherman at work would be surprised at Peter's taking this leadership role. Even with the technology of the 21st century, commercial fishing is no job for the faint of heart. Demanding and dangerous, it requires steady nerves, raw courage, great physical strength, and an ability to act decisively and instantly when conditions demand. And those conditions were far worse in the first century. Much of Peter's life had been spent on the open water in tiny boats, dwarfed by the elements, spray-drenched, sails flapping wildly in wind, waves convulsing his vessel. His hometown, Capernaum, like every fishing village in the world, ancient or modern, mourned with tragic frequency the drowned, the maimed, and those who went to work and were never seen again. Such was fishing, and such was Peter, the improbable spokesman for this most improbable group of men. His voice, so often in the past raised above the roar of wind and crashing water, now resounded over the throng of curious spectators surrounding and following the apostles. "Jews, and all you who live in Jerusalem, understand this," he cried. "Give me your attention." Puzzled, the crowd fell silent. "These men are not drunk as you assume. It is only the 3rd hour of the day." Carefully, methodically, the big fisherman, his hands calloused, laid before his listeners a version of biblical prophecy. Had they read, he asked, the prophet Joel? "And it shall happen in the last days, says God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, so that your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, so that your young men shall see visions, so that your old men shall dream dreams. And I will cause wonders to happen in the heaven above." Inside the temple walls were a series of courtyards, each more restrictive than the last. Like the Gentiles, women had their own area of court outside the court of Israelites and the court of priests. The main sacrificial altar loomed before the entrance to the holy central shrine, which was divided inside into 2 sections separated by a curtain. In the first section, the priests made preparations twice daily for the morning and evening sacrifices. Beyond the veil and the curtain, in the room known as the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant was believed by some to be present still. Only the high priest was permitted to pass through the veil, separating the Holy of Holies from the anteroom, only once a year, and always aware that a misstep could result in his death. The temple bustled with activity from dawn to nightfall, and not just religious activity. Every adult male among the 80,000 Jews who lived in Jerusalem year-round was required, under the ancient laws, to pay a yearly temple tax of 1/2 shekel each. The value of a shekel remains obscure, but according to the Old Testament book of Exodus, 30 shekels was the price of a slave. There were also free will offerings, publicly applauded, bequests and gifts, wood offerings for the sacrifices, and periodic fundraising drives for special needs. In the temple treasury sat trumpet-shaped containers, into which worshippers could drop coins. One such worshipper was the widow celebrated in Mark's Gospel, who gave just 2 small coins, the widow's mite. Jesus, seeing what she had done, remarked that by giving all that she had contributed far more than the wealthiest donor. The annual cash flow supporting the work of thousands of priests and other personnel and funding the rest of the staggering overhead costs had long before made the temple an important commercial center. Bankers kept monies on deposit in the temple. The fourth book of Maccabees speaks of private fortunes held there for safekeeping. Much of the temple's commerce arose in support of religious ceremonies. In particular, the unending rounds of animal sacrifices that occurred there each day. Bulls, calves, sheep, goats, and birds were sold on the premises. So many animals were brought to the temple for sacrifice that the entire livestock industry in the area around Jerusalem was said to be devoted to that purpose. Thousands of priests, along with their Levite guards and assistants and hosts of others, were required to keep all of this going. Each priest served a week's duty in the temple, at the rate of about 700 priests a week on a 24-hour week rotating schedule, with as many as 18,000 priests from Jerusalem included in the rotation. During their 1 or 2 weeks of service each year, they were entitled to keep some of what remained of the sacrificial animals, particularly hides, which could be sold to boost a priest's income. Under ancient law, they were also entitled to offerings specifically collected for their income, but many priests lived in poverty. Although the taxes and offerings were scripturally required, not all were paid, and there were huge expenses to meet besides a priest's salaries. The sacrifices began at dawn with the solemn killing and butchering of a lamb by priests bedecked in white linen, and sashes decorated with flowers of crimson, purple, and blue. Sacrificial ceremonies continued throughout the day, accompanied by singing and cymbal crashing. In addition to the communal rituals, there were privately funded sacrifices, paid for by individuals or families grateful for spiritual favors, seeking benefits, or fulfilling religious vows. A second lamb would be sacrificed on behalf of the community as a whole each evening, just before conclusion of the daily service. Those ceremonies were conducted with reverence, the din raised by hundreds of men at work and hosts of animals in captivity and distress was deafening. Smoke rose from the burnt offerings, the sweet odor of wood flames and roasting flesh mingling with the stench of incinerated bones and hair settling heavily over the city. An unending river of blood coursing from the beasts' carefully slit throats flowed away through an elaborate system of sewers and sluices above and below ground. Despite the slaughterhouse motif, or perhaps because of it, the atmosphere in and around the temple was lively, charged with excitement, even joyful. Excited and exhausted pilgrims of all ages and descriptions arrived on foot, meeting other travelers, reuniting with family members, setting up camp around the city, singing and praying and weeping happily. During the great pilgrimage festivals, Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread in the spring, the Feast of Pentecost 7 weeks later, and the Feast of Tabernacles in autumn, as many as 250,000 visitors would descend upon Jerusalem, all under holy obligation to offer temple sacrifices, as singers sang and pipers played. Drawn by the bustle and commotion and eager to see or be seen by the swarms of worshippers were scholars, soldiers, merchants, beggars, tourists, prophets, and pickpockets, jostling each other daily on the temple platform, in what one modern scholar described as a Judean version of London's Hyde Park corner. In mid-afternoon, Peter and John and the others, not yet known as Christians and not yet feared or despised by the temple hierarchy, approached the 35-acre temple complex, intending to worship with the other Jews. Surrounded by fellow beggars at the entrance known as the Beautiful Gate was a crippled man who called out to them, appealing for alms, a handout. Much of the population of Jerusalem was dependent upon charity, and the temple was the center of various formal and informal means of aiding the poor. Peter studied this particular beggar intently, recognizing him as a familiar figure, a man who, aged about 40 and unable to walk, was carried daily to the gate by his friends. But there was something unusual about his fierce, desperate appeal that day. John, too, stopped and looked at the man. Suddenly Peter spoke. "Look at us." The man struggled eagerly to sit up, hoping that he was about to receive a good-sized donation. Instead, Peter said something quite remarkable. "I have no silver or gold, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, walk." And with that, he reached down, took the man by his right hand, and pulled him up. The writer Luke, trained as a physician, describes what happened to the man next. Immediately, his feet and ankles were strengthened. He leapt to his feet, testing them cautiously at first, walking about tentatively, and then he began walking and leaping and praising God. All of this happened in full view of the crowds in the temple area. The man, who had spent much of his life begging at the gate, was well known to the temple's faithful, who now saw him leaping about like a child. It was astounding. Overcome with emotion, the man clung to Peter and John as they entered the temple, its magnificent gold-covered facade glowing in the afternoon sun. Joining the crowd, funneling into the area, the disciples and their new follower climbed a broad stairway up the entrance gate, entering as others who had already completed their business in the temple exited from a smaller gate slightly to the west. Peter and John had been intent on worship, but the excited company around them grew larger as word of what had happened spread. They reached an area known as Solomon's Colonnade before they were so surrounded by onlookers that they could go no further.